My parents used my inheritance to pay my brother's gambling debts, then asked me to forgive him. My grandfather died when I was 26, and the will he left behind split everything three ways between my father, my aunt, and a trust meant for the grandchildren, to be distributed when we each turned 30. Mine was supposed to come through 2 years ago. It came through, technically. It just didn't come through to me. I found out by accident, the way I seem to find out about most things that matter in my family, not through a conversation, not through honesty, but through a slip. My mother mentioned in passing during a phone call about something completely unrelated that your father finally got Ronnie's situation handled. I asked what situation. She went quiet in a way I'd learned over 30 years to recognize as the sound of someone realizing they'd said too much. It's not really my place, she said, which from my mother has always meant it's exactly the kind of thing I should be told, but I'm hoping you won't push. I pushed. It took 2 days, several tense phone calls, and finally a conversation with my father where I made it clear I wasn't hanging up until I had an actual answer, before the full picture came together. My younger brother Ronnie had accumulated just under $90,000 in gambling debt over 18 months, sports betting apps, mostly, the kind that make losing money feel like a video game, until you check your bank balance and realize it wasn't a game at all. Some of it was owed to legitimate casinos and betting platforms. Some of it, more alarmingly, was owed to people my father described only as not the kind you want showing up at your door. To make it disappear, my parents had drained Ronnie's portion of the trust first. When that wasn't enough, they'd used mine. We were going to tell you, my father said, in the tone of a man who believed intention mattered more than outcome. We just didn't want to worry you before it was resolved. It's my money, I said. You don't get to spend someone else's inheritance and then decide when they're allowed to find out. We saved your brother's life, my mother said, jumping in the way she always did when my father's explanations started sounding thin even to himself. Do you understand that? Those people don't just send threatening letters. Your father had to meet someone in a parking lot to hand over cash. We were terrified. We did what we had to do to protect this family. And yes, that included using money that was earmarked for you. Because in that moment, your safety net felt less urgent than your brother's actual safety. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I understood on some level the impossible math of that decision, a child in danger versus a child's financial cushion, an emergency versus an inconvenience. If I'd been in the room when that decision was made, I might have even agreed to some version of it myself temporarily as a stopgap. What I couldn't get past was that I hadn't been in the room. I hadn't been told. I hadn't been asked. My money had simply been reclassified without my knowledge or consent from mine to the family's the moment someone else needed it more. The trust had been worth just under $72,000 by the time it matured. All of it was gone, not some of it. All of it, I asked to see the paperwork, mostly because some stubborn part of me needed to see the number in writing rather than just hear it spoken over the phone. My father hesitated before agreeing, which told me something on its own, and it took another week of asking before he finally forwarded a statement from the trust's financial institution. Seeing it in black and white didn't make it feel more real, exactly. It had felt plenty real already, but it did something else, something colder. It turned an emotional wound into a documented fact, a line item, a withdrawal with a date and a signature that wasn't mine, authorizing a transfer out of an account that had my name on it as sole beneficiary. My father had used his standing as trustee, a role my grandfather had assigned him purely as an administrative formality, to move money that was never legally his to move in the first place. I sat with that document open on my laptop for the better part of an evening, not entirely sure what I planned to do with it, only sure that I needed to have it, needed proof to exist somewhere outside of my own memory of a phone call. My grandfather, if he'd known, would have been furious. He was a meticulous man, a retired accountant who structured that trust specifically so no single family member could unilaterally raid another's portion, or at least that's what he told me once, years before he died, sitting on his porch explaining why he'd set things up the way he had. Money makes people do things they'd never admit to doing otherwise, he'd said. I've seen it wreck better families than ours. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I understood it completely now, sitting alone with a bank statement that proved him right from beyond the grave. For the next several months, I existed in a strange, low-grade static of resentment I didn't fully know what to do with. I didn't cut my parents off, the damage didn't feel dramatic enough in my own head to justify something that extreme, even though looking back now I think it absolutely would have justified it. Instead, I just got quieter with them. I stopped calling as often. I let voicemails sit for days before returning them. I found excuses to skip family dinners that I used to attend without a second thought. Ronnie, for his part, avoided the subject entirely. We'd never been especially close, 6 years apart, different interests, different friend groups our whole lives, but we'd always been civil, easy enough around each other at holidays. After the trust situation, even that civility curdled into something more like careful distance. I think he knew what had happened. I think he chose not to bring it up because bringing it up would have required him to actually reckon with what his choices had cost someone else, and reckoning had never exactly been Ronnie's strong suit. He got help, eventually, a gambling addiction program his insurance covered most of, weekly meetings, the whole structure. I want to be clear that I was glad about that, genuinely. I never once wished addiction on my brother, never once thought he deserved to suffer for suffering's sake. But being glad someone is getting help and being willing to personally underwrite the cost of their relapse are two very different things, and my family, it turned out, could not tell the difference between them. My isolation from my parents during those months wasn't dramatic on the surface. I didn't announce I was pulling away. I didn't send an angry text laying out grievances. I just slowly stopped being available in the ways I used to be, declining Sunday dinners with vague excuses about work, letting my mother's calls ring through to voicemail more often than not, keeping my responses in the family group chat short and functional. My girlfriend at the time, Jenna, was the one who eventually pointed out what I was doing without realizing it. "You've basically gone gray rock on your own parents," she said one night, using a term she'd picked up from a podcast about difficult family dynamics. "You know that, right?" I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but she wasn't wrong. It was the only tool I had that didn't require a full explosion, a slow, quiet withdrawal instead of the confrontation I didn't yet feel ready to have. My mother noticed eventually, the way mothers usually do even when you think you're being subtle. She called one afternoon just to ask directly if something was wrong between us. I almost lied. I almost said I was just busy with work, the same excuse I'd been leaning on for weeks. Instead, for the first time, I told her plainly that I was still processing what had happened with the trust and that I needed space rather than forced normalcy. She didn't take it well. "You're going to let money come between you and this family?" She asked, as if $72,000 taken without my knowledge was a minor disagreement rather than a fundamental breach of trust. I didn't have the energy to argue the framing. I just told her I loved her and that I needed time, and I hung up before the conversation could spiral further. The real confrontation came 8 months later, at a family barbecue my aunt hosted for the 4th of July. Ronnie had been sober from gambling for almost a year by then, chip and all, the kind of small plastic token his meetings gave out for milestones. My parents had brought it up twice already that afternoon, proudly, the way you'd announce a promotion or an engagement. It was my father who finally raised the actual subject, pulling me aside near the cooler while everyone else was distracted by a game of cornhole in the yard. "Your brother's been asking about you," he said. "He feels like there's distance between you two. He knows why. He wants to make it right." "Making it right would involve paying me back," I said. "Has anyone mentioned that as an option?" My father's face tightened. "He doesn't have that kind of money, you know that. He's barely keeping up with his meeting fees and his rent. So the plan is that I just absorb it permanently." "The plan," my father said, lowering his voice, "is that you forgive him. That's what family does. He's your brother. He made a terrible mistake, and he's working every day to be better, and all we're asking is that you meet him partway. Come to dinner. Let him apologize properly. Stop punishing him for something he can't undo." "I'm not punishing him," I said. "I've barely spoken to him in 8 months, not because I'm plotting revenge, but because every time I picture his face, I picture $72,000 evaporating without my permission. That's not punishment. That's just what happens to trust when it's broken and nobody offers a real path to rebuilding it." My mother had drifted over by then, drawn by the tension the way she always was, incapable of letting a hard conversation happen without inserting herself into it. "We're not asking you to pretend it didn't happen. We're asking you to forgive him. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." "No," I agreed. "But it usually means the person asking for it has actually acknowledged what they did, to the person they did it to directly, without a parent running interference. Has Ronnie ever said any of this to me himself? Has he ever called me, alone, and apologized specifically for what happened to my inheritance instead of a vague, 'I know I messed up at Thanksgiving,' that could apply to literally anything?" Neither of them had an answer for that, because the answer, we all knew, was no. My aunt, who had overheard part of the conversation while refilling a tray of watermelon nearby, chimed in unexpectedly. "For what it's worth," she said, addressing my parents more than me, "I think he's allowed to feel however he feels about this. You two made a unilateral decision with someone else's money. That's not a small thing to just wave away because Ronnie's doing better now." My mother shot her a look that could have curdled milk, but my aunt didn't back down. And for the first time since this whole situation started, I felt like someone in my extended family was willing to say the obvious thing out loud instead of tiptoeing around it to preserve the peace. My father muttered something about not needing outside opinions on a family matter, which struck me as almost funny, given that outside opinions were exactly what this family could have used 2 years earlier. Before a decision, this large got made in a closed room with nobody accountable to check it. I found Ronnie a few minutes later, sitting by himself near the fence line, away from the noise of the party, nursing a can of soda instead of the beer everyone else was drinking. I sat down next to him without saying anything for a while. "They sent you over here to talk to me, didn't they?" he said eventually. "Something like that." He turned the can over in his hands. "I know what I did. I think about it more than you probably think I do. I know sorry doesn't fix a number like that. I don't even know how to start fixing a number like that." It was the first time in 8 months that anyone in my family had said something to me about this that felt less like a strategy and more like an actual person being honest. "That's the first real thing anyone in this family has said to me about any of this," I told him. "I've been scared to bring it up," he admitted. "Every time I think about calling you, I think about how much I'd have to actually say, and it feels easier to just let mom and dad handle it." which I know is exactly the kind of thing that got me into this mess in the first place. Letting other people absorb the consequences for me. That conversation didn't fix $72,000. It didn't erase 8 months of distance in an afternoon. But it was the first thing either of us had said that felt like it was actually between the two of us, rather than filtered through two parents desperate to smooth things over before they had to sit with how badly they'd handled it themselves. We worked out an arrangement over the following weeks, just the two of us, without our parents involved at all. Ronnie couldn't pay back $72,000, not anytime close to soon, but he could commit to something concrete instead of a vague promise. $200 a month, automatic transfer, no exceptions, for as long as it took, alongside continued attendance at his meetings, which he agreed to let me confirm periodically, not out of distrust exactly, but because trust, once broken that badly, has to be rebuilt in verifiable pieces rather than taken on faith all at once. It'll take him decades at that rate to repay what was taken. I've made peace with the fact that I may never see the full amount, that this arrangement is really more about the principle of accountability than the actual math working out cleanly. What matters to me is that it's between us now, not something my parents get to manage, minimize, or rush on our behalf. My parents didn't take well to being cut out of the resolution process. My father, in particular, seemed almost offended that Ronnie and I had worked out an arrangement without him mediating it. I've been trying to fix this for months, he said, when I told him calmly that Ronnie and I had a plan and didn't need help managing it. And you're telling me I don't get to be part of the solution? You were part of the problem, I said, as gently as I could manage while still being honest. I think it's fair that the solution doesn't run through you this time. That conversation strained things between my father and me for a while afterward. He seemed to interpret my independence from his mediation as a rejection of him personally, rather than what it actually was, a boundary built specifically around the role he'd played in creating the situation in the first place. It took several more months and one long, difficult conversation over coffee, just the two of us, before he was able to say, without qualifications or excuses, that he understood why I needed to handle things with Ronnie directly, and that he regretted not asking me before making the decision he'd made 2 years earlier. It wasn't a perfect apology. It came late, and it came only after I'd made clear I wasn't going to keep circling back to the subject indefinitely waiting for one. But it came, eventually, and I've chosen to count that for something. I still see my parents. I still love them, in the complicated way you love people who failed you badly while genuinely believing they were protecting you. But I stopped accepting their version of forgiveness as something I owed automatically, on their timeline for their comfort. Forgiveness, I've learned, is something I get to define for myself, on my own terms, extended directly to the person who wronged me, not handed down as an obligation by people who found it easier to ask for grace than to offer real accountability themselves. Ronnie still sends his $200 on the first of every month, without fail, and every few months we get coffee, just the two of us, and talk about things that have nothing to do with debt or trust funds or the parking lot our father once had to visit to keep him safe. It's slow. It's not the relationship we might have had without any of this. But it's honest, finally, in a way very little in my family managed to be for most of my life. And honest, it turns out, was the thing I actually needed all along, more than the money, more than an apology delivered on anyone else's schedule, more than being told to simply let it go.